Room 408. The rain had started just after sunset, one of those relentless downpours that made the roads slick and blurred the edges of the world. James Parker tightened his grip on the steering wheel, squinting at the faint yellow lines barely visible through the windshield. He'd been driving for hours, and exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. When he saw the flickering neon sign for the Maple Ridge Motel, it felt like a godsend. The sign buzzed weakly, casting a sickly greenish glow onto the puddled parking lot. James pulled into the lot, killed the engine, and sat for a moment, listening to the steady drumming of the rain on the car roof. The office smelled faintly of mildew and cigarettes. A bored-looking woman sat behind the counter, her eyes glued to a tiny TV playing a soap opera rerun. She didn't look up as James approached. "Need a room," he said, digging into his pocket for his wallet. She sighed heavily, like even this was asking too much of her. "Just you?" "Yeah, just me." She slid a key across the counter. The brass tag attached to it read 409. The room was as drab as he'd expected. A lumpy bed, a small TV bolted to a table, and wallpaper that had probably been yellow at some point, but was now closer to the color of old teeth. Still, it was warm and dry. James threw his bag onto the chair and kicked off his boots. It was just past midnight when he heard it. At first, he thought it was the rain, but no, this was different. Faint at first, barely audible over the static hum of the old motel. A muffled sound, like someone crying. James sat up in bed, blinking into the darkness. He glanced toward the wall separating his room from the next one, room 408. The crying grew louder, a raw, keening sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He swung his legs off the bed and pressed his ear to the wall. "Hello?" he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. The crying stopped. James stared at the wall, his breath held, straining to hear anything else. Nothing, just silence. He sat back down, shaking his head. Long day, too tired, hearing things. But then it started again. This time, it wasn't crying, it was screaming. James stormed out of his room barefoot, the hallway carpet rough against his soles. He stood in front of room 408, his hand hovering over the door. "Hello?" he called out again, louder this time. No answer, just that same blood-curdling scream. He tried the handle, but it was locked. He knocked, hard, the sound echoing down the empty hall. "Hey, are you okay in there?" The screaming stopped abruptly, leaving only the hollow sound of rain tapping against the motel windows. "Listen," James said, his voice shaking now. "I'm gonna get help, okay?" He turned back toward his room, but the woman from the front desk was already there, standing at the end of the hall. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Someone's in there," James said, jabbing a thumb toward room 408. "They're screaming." "No one's in there." James blinked. "What?" Her expression darkened. "Nobody's rented 408 for years." The front desk clerk refused to answer any more questions. She muttered something about leaving well enough alone and hurried back to the office. James didn't press her. He had bigger concerns. Back in his room, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, the sound of that scream echoed in his head. He stared at the wall separating him from room 408. Something wasn't right about this place. He could feel it now, like a cold draft sneaking under the door. At 3:17 a.m., the screaming started again. James threw the covers off and grabbed his phone. The flashlight beam sliced through the dark as he crept toward the wall. This time the sound was even louder, like whoever, or whatever, was in 408 was right on the other side of the paper-thin partition. He slammed his palm against the wall. Who's there? The screaming stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whisper. Help me. James felt the floor drop out from under him. The voice was faint, like it was coming from far away, but he could swear he recognized it. He pressed his ear to the wall, his pulse pounding in his ears. Who are you? He whispered. The reply sent a chill down his spine. You. The next morning, James demanded answers. The clerk was gone, replaced by an older man who looked like he hadn't slept in years. When James mentioned room 408, the man stiffened. Room 408's been closed for a long time, the man said, his voice low. Why? James asked. The man hesitated, then leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. A guy killed himself in there, slashed his wrists. But folks around here think he never really left. They say sometimes at night he calls out, looking for someone to take his place. James felt his stomach turn. He grabbed his bag, threw it into his truck, and peeled out of the parking lot without looking back. The unread message. The first text came at 11:13 p.m., just as David Carter was brushing his teeth. His phone buzzed on the bathroom counter, its glow casting an eerie light in the dim room. Hey, Davy. David froze, toothbrush halfway to his mouth. Only one person had ever called him that, his sister, Emily. But Emily had been dead for nearly 2 years. He picked up the phone, staring at the message. It was from an unknown number. His mind raced. Maybe it was some cruel joke, a scam, or a glitch. He locked the screen and went back to brushing his teeth, trying to shake the icy feeling crawling up his spine. But he couldn't. The next message came the following night, just after midnight. I miss you, Davy. This time he didn't hesitate. He typed back, his fingers trembling. Who is this? How did you get this number? 3 dots appeared, then vanished, then appeared again. The response came after what felt like an eternity. It's me. M. David stared at the screen, his heart pounding. Memories of Emily flooded back. Her laugh, her stubbornness, the way she always looked out for him, even when she didn't have to. The last time he'd seen her was at her funeral, her pale face framed by roses. This isn't funny, he typed. Emily's gone. The reply came instantly. I know. I'm not here. But I can still see you. David didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of his bed, phone clutched in his hand, waiting for another message. None came. By morning, he'd convinced himself it was some elaborate hoax, a sick joke played by someone who'd gotten a hold of Emily's old phone or hacked into his family's accounts. But as the day wore on, doubts crept in. Whoever it was, they knew things only Emily could know. Little things. Her childhood nickname for him. The exact way she used to sign off her texts with a heart emoji. Always the pink one. That night, the texts started again. Do you remember the fort we built in the woods? David's breath caught. The fort. They'd built it when they were kids. A ramshackle structure of old boards and rusty nails, hidden deep in the forest behind their house. No one else had known about it, just him and Emily. Who are you? He typed back, his hands shaking. I told you. It's me. I'm trying to warn you, Davy. The texts kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. Emily, or whoever was pretending to be her, knew things no one else could. The way their father used to whistle Sweet Caroline while fixing the car. The time they'd accidentally broken their mother's favorite vase and blamed it on the dog. I forgave you for that, the next message said. David felt a lump rise in his throat. What do you want from me? He typed. This time the reply chilled him to the bone. He's coming for you. David couldn't make sense of it. Who was coming? Why? He tried calling the number, but it went straight to voicemail. He went to the police, but they dismissed it as a prank. But blocking it didn't stop the messages. They came from different numbers now, each one saying the same thing in Emily's voice. He's coming for you. The following night, the texts changed. He's close, Davy. Don't go to the basement. David's blood ran cold. He lived alone in the house he and Emily had grown up in. The basement had always unsettled him, even as a kid. It was dark, damp, and filled with shadows that seemed to shift when no one was looking. But now, something compelled him to go down there. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was defiance. He grabbed a flashlight and descended the creaking stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. The air in the basement was colder than usual, and it smelled faintly of earth and mildew. David swept the beam of his flashlight across the room. Everything looked normal. Old boxes, cobwebbed shelves, the ancient washing machine that barely worked. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his fingers numb. He's behind you. David spun around, the flashlight shaking in his grip. The beam landed on a dark figure standing at the bottom of the stairs. It wasn't fully solid, more like a shadow given form, with eyes that glowed faintly red. "Who are you?" David whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. It stepped closer and David stumbled back, his foot catching on a loose board. He hit the ground hard, the flashlight skittering away. His phone buzzed again. "Run." David scrambled to his feet and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind him. He didn't stop running until he was in his car, speeding down the rain-slick road, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The texts didn't stop. "You can't run, Davy. He'll find you. I tried to warn you." The last message came just as his car sputtered to a stop on an empty stretch of highway. "Goodbye, Davy." The last thing David saw was a pair of glowing red eyes in his rearview mirror.